The wind carried whispers through the skeletal remains of downtown Seattle, rattling the shattered glass of skyscrapers that once touched the clouds with human ambition. Kalen pressed his back against the cold concrete wall of what used to be a coffee shop, listening to the symphony of destruction that had become the city's new heartbeat. 3 years had passed since the outbreak turned 90% of humanity into mindless predators, yet the sound of their shuffling feet still made his pulse quicken. He adjusted the worn leather strap of his crossbow and peered around the corner, where Solara crouched behind an overturned delivery truck, her auburn hair catching the pale morning light like fire against ash. The silence between them spoke volumes. They had developed an unspoken language born of necessity, where a raised hand meant freeze, a pointed finger indicated direction, and the slightest nod confirmed understanding. Solara's emerald eyes met his across the debris-strewn street, and in them, Kalen saw the same exhaustion that plagued his own reflection. She raised 2 fingers, then pointed toward the pharmacy they desperately needed to reach. Antibiotics for Thorn, their injured companion who waited in their makeshift shelter 6 blocks away, fighting an infection that could claim his life as surely as any zombie bite. Kalen nodded and began his careful advance, stepping over the bleached bones of a cat and around a child's tricycle that rust had claimed as its own. The pharmacy's windows were intact, a rare blessing that suggested either incredible luck or a deadly trap. As he moved closer, the familiar stench of decay drifted on the wind, sweet and nauseating, mingling with the smell of mold and abandonment that permeated everything in this new world. Behind him, Solara's footsteps whispered against broken asphalt, each movement calculated and precise. The pharmacy door hung open like a gaping mouth, its automatic sensors long dead. Kalen paused at the threshold, straining his ears for any sound that might betray lurking danger. Inside, shelves stood like tombstones in neat rows, their contents scattered and ransacked by previous scavengers. Medical supplies were more valuable than gold now, and every expedition into the city was a gamble with death. He signaled to Solara, who took position by the entrance while he ventured deeper into the store's shadowy interior. Dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight that penetrated the gloom, creating an almost ethereal atmosphere that belied the horror of their situation. Kalen's fingers traced along empty shelves until he found what remained of the antibiotic section. Most of the stronger medications were gone, but buried behind expired vitamins, he discovered a small cache of amoxicillin that some desperate soul had apparently overlooked. His heart soared with relief as he stuffed the precious bottles into his backpack, each one representing another day Thorn might live. A low moan echoed from somewhere deep within the pharmacy, followed by the distinctive scraping sound of dragging feet. Kalen's blood turned to ice as he realized they were not alone. The creature emerged from behind the prescription counter, its pharmacist's coat hanging in tatters from its decomposing frame. What had once been a middle-aged woman now shambled toward him with the relentless hunger that defined the infected. Her eyes, clouded and lifeless, fixed on him with predatory focus. Solara appeared beside him as if materialized from shadow, her knife already in hand. The blade found its mark with practiced efficiency, sliding between the creature's vertebrae with barely a whisper. The zombie crumpled to the floor, joining countless others in their eternal rest. They shared a moment of silent acknowledgement before continuing their search, knowing that where there was one infected, others might follow. Time was running out, and Thorn's fever was climbing higher with each passing hour. As they prepared to leave, Kalen noticed something that made his heart clench with unexpected emotion. Scattered across the floor near the pharmacy counter were family photos, their frames cracked but images still visible. A young couple on their wedding day, children blowing out birthday candles, graduation ceremonies filled with hope and promise. These glimpses of humanity's lost dreams reminded him of everything they were fighting to preserve, even as the world crumbled around them. Solara tugged at his sleeve, her touch gentle but urgent. Outside, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, promising rain that would bring new challenges. The infected moved differently in rain, their senses dulled but their aggression heightened. They needed to reach safety before the first drops fell. Together, They slipped back into the empty streets, two souls navigating the graveyard of civilization with nothing but determination and each other to light their way forward through the gathering darkness. The journey back to their sanctuary proved more treacherous than anticipated. Rain began falling in fat, heavy drops that drummed against abandoned cars and created rivulets of mud in the streets. Kalen and Solara moved with heightened caution, knowing that the precipitation would mask both their movements and those of potential threats. The infected seemed to emerge from every shadow, drawn by some primal instinct that the living could never fully understand. 3 times they were forced to take cover, pressing themselves against doorways while small groups of zombies shuffled past, their vacant stares fixed on distant stimuli only they could perceive. Their shelter was a reinforced bookstore basement that Thorn had discovered during their first week in the city. The previous owners had apparently been preparing for some kind of disaster, installing heavy steel doors and stocking emergency supplies. Ironic that their preparations had been rendered useless by a catastrophe no one could have imagined. Kalen punched in the security code they had established, and the reinforced door swung open to reveal their temporary home, illuminated by battery-powered lanterns that cast dancing shadows on walls lined with books no one would ever read again. Thorn lay on a makeshift bed of cushions and blankets, his dark skin glistening with fever sweat. His usually bright smile was absent, replaced by the grimace of someone fighting a battle within his own body. Zephyr, the youngest member of their group at barely 17, sat beside him with a damp cloth, gently cooling his forehead. Her platinum blonde hair had grown longer since the outbreak, and she had grown older in ways that had nothing to do with time. The innocence that had once sparkled in her blue eyes had been replaced by a weariness that spoke of too much loss witnessed too young. Kalen wasted no time in preparing the antibiotics, his hands steady despite the urgency he felt. Solara assisted by gathering clean water and sterile supplies while Zephyr continued her vigil. They had all learned basic medical skills through necessity and trial, becoming jacks of all trades in a world that no longer offered the luxury of specialization. As Thorn swallowed the first dose of medication, Kalen felt a glimmer of hope that had become increasingly rare in their daily existence. The rain intensified outside, drumming against the bookstore's windows like skeletal fingers seeking entry. Through the reinforced glass, they could see shapes moving in the storm, zombies drawn by whatever mysterious forces guided their endless wandering. The group settled into their evening routine, sharing a meager meal of canned soup and stale crackers while Solara read aloud from one of the many books surrounding them. Tonight she chose poetry, her voice weaving through verses about love and loss that seemed to speak directly to their situation. As darkness deepened, they took turns standing watch while others tried to rest. Kalen found himself on the first shift, peering through the reinforced windows at the apocalyptic landscape beyond. The storm had transformed the familiar streets into an alien waterworld where debris floated like ghosts and the infected moved with an eerie, underwater grace. Lightning illuminated the scene in stark, horrifying detail, revealing the true extent of civilization's collapse in brief, brilliant moments. During the quiet hours, when only the storm spoke and his companions slept fitfully nearby, Kalen allowed himself to remember the world that was. He thought of summer barbecues with friends, of movie theaters filled with laughter, of busy coffee shops where people complained about trivial inconveniences that now seemed like paradise. These memories were both a comfort and a torment, reminding him of everything they had lost while strengthening his resolve to protect what little remained. Somewhere in this devastated world, other survivors were fighting the same battle, clinging to hope with bloodied fingernails while the darkness pressed in from all sides. The storm raged until dawn, finally giving way to a pale, watery sun that revealed a city washed clean but emptier than ever. Kalen watched the last of the rainwater drain away, carrying with it the debris of human achievement. In a few hours, Zephyr would take over watch duty, then Solara, then Thorn if his fever broke as they all prayed it would. This was their rhythm now, their new normal in a world that had forgotten what normal meant. By the third day, Thorn's fever had broken, and color was returning to his face. The antibiotics had worked their modern miracle, pulling him back from the brink of an infection that would have claimed him in any previous era of human history. Zephyr celebrated by finding a dusty bottle of wine in the bookstore's back office, and they shared it carefully, savoring the rare moment of genuine joy. Thorn's recovery felt like a victory against the apocalypse itself, proof that humanity could still triumph over the forces arrayed against them. Their celebration was short-lived, however, as Solara discovered troubling news during her morning reconnaissance. Large groups of infected were converging on their section of the city, drawn by some stimulus they couldn't identify. The migration patterns of zombies remained one of the great mysteries of their new world, but the implications were clear: they would need to move soon or risk being overrun by sheer numbers. The prospect of leaving their secure shelter filled everyone with dread, but survival demanded constant adaptation. They spent the day planning their next move, studying maps and discussing routes while Thorn regained his strength. Avalon District, several miles north, was rumored to have an active survivor community that had managed to establish some semblance of permanent settlement. The journey would be dangerous, requiring them to cross territory controlled by both the infected and potentially hostile human groups, but staying was no longer an option. As evening approached, they began gathering their essential supplies, each person limited to what they could carry comfortably during a long march. The bookstore that had been their home for 2 weeks would soon become just another empty building in a city full of abandoned dreams. Kalen ran his fingers along the spines of books that chronicled human knowledge and imagination, wondering if anyone would ever again have the luxury of losing themselves in fictional worlds. Literature had once been humanity's way of exploring infinite possibilities. Now they were trapped in a reality more horrifying than any dystopian novel ever written. As they prepared for sleep before their departure the next morning, Solara approached Kalen with a small leather journal she had found among the bookstore's inventory. Its pages were blank, waiting for stories that might never be told. She pressed it into his hands with a gentle smile, encouraging him to document their experiences for whoever might someday find it. The gesture touched something deep within him, a reminder that even in the darkest times, humans clung to the need to bear witness, to leave proof that they had existed and fought and loved. That night, by the flickering light of their last evening in the shelter, Kalen began to write. The morning of their departure dawned clear and cold, with frost decorating the abandoned cars like nature's attempt at memorial flowers. They moved through their final preparations with practiced efficiency, each person checking and rechecking their gear while Thorn stretched and tested his recovered strength. The infection had left him slightly weakened, but his spirit burned as bright as ever, and he insisted on carrying his full share of their supplies. Zephyr had fashioned a sling for her crossbow from salvaged fabric, while Solara checked the edge on her collection of knives with the methodical care of a surgeon preparing for surgery. Their route would take them through the old university district, where ivy-covered buildings stood like monuments to learning in a world that had forgotten how to teach anything but survival. Kalen had studied the maps carefully, plotting a path that avoided the main arteries where infected tended to congregate while staying clear of the territorial markers left by hostile human groups. In this new world, other survivors could be as dangerous as zombies, driven to desperate measures by hunger, fear, and the gradual erosion of moral boundaries that civilization had once maintained. As they stepped outside into the crisp morning air, the bookstore sealed behind them with the finality of a tomb closing. The streets stretched before them like arteries in a body that had stopped breathing, their surfaces cracked and overgrown with weeds that pushed through concrete with determined optimism. Nature was already beginning the long process of reclaiming what humanity had built, and in a few decades, this concrete jungle would transform into something entirely different. They moved in single file with practice spacing, Solara taking point while Kalen brought up the rear, their formation designed to provide maximum visibility while minimizing their group's profile. The infected were generally solitary hunters, but they occasionally formed loose packs that could overwhelm even well-prepared survivors. Every shadow could hide death, every corner might conceal a trap, and every step forward required a careful calculation of risk versus necessity. The university campus revealed itself gradually as they climbed a gentle hill, its Gothic architecture still magnificent despite broken windows and ivy that had grown wild across limestone facades. Students had once walked these paths carrying backpacks full of textbooks and dreams. Now only the survivors moved through the quadrangles, their bags filled with weapons and medical supplies. Kalen paused beside a bronze statue of the university's founder, its patina now stained with something darker than age, and wondered what that long-dead educator would think of what his institution had become. Near the campus center, they encountered their first significant obstacle, a group of 5 infected that had apparently been faculty members before the outbreak. They still wore the remnants of their professional attire, now torn and stained beyond recognition, but their movements retained none of the dignity they had possessed in life. Solara signaled for the group to halt while she assessed the situation, counting exits and evaluating terrain advantages with the tactical mind she had developed through necessity. The engagement was swift and efficient, their weapons finding their marks with the grim precision that had kept them alive when billions of others had fallen. Afterward, they stood in the silence that always followed such encounters, each person processing the violence in their own way while scanning for additional threats. Thorn whispered a brief prayer over the fallen, a habit he had maintained despite everything, still believing that the souls of the infected deserved some acknowledgement of what they had once been. As they continued through the campus, Zephyr pointed out details that the others missed: student artwork still hanging in windows, a coffee cart overturned but with its menu board still advertising specialty drinks, dormitory windows where personal belongings created silhouettes of interrupted lives. Her artist's eye captured the poetry in devastation, finding beauty in the most unlikely places. She had begun sketching their journey in a small pad, creating a visual record to accompany Kalen's written chronicle. The campus library proved to be an unexpected goldmine of practical resources, its basement containing emergency supplies that previous scavengers had overlooked. They discovered water purification tablets, emergency blankets, and even some expired but potentially useful medications. More importantly, they found detailed topographical maps of the region that would help them navigate the treacherous terrain ahead. Knowledge remained power, even in a world where most learning had become irrelevant. Their progress slowed as they moved deeper into disputed territory, areas where competing survivor groups had established informal boundaries marked by graffiti, improvised barriers, and occasionally more gruesome warnings. These human settlements represented both hope and danger. While they proved that organized communities were possible, they also demonstrated how quickly civilization's veneer could crack under pressure. Some groups had maintained something resembling moral standards, while others had devolved into little more than organized predators. As afternoon shadows began to lengthen, they reached the outskirts of Avalon District, where rumors suggested a functioning community had taken root in a fortified shopping complex. The buildings ahead showed signs of deliberate modification: reinforced entrances, watchtowers constructed from shopping carts and scrap metal, and gardens planted in parking lots where vegetables grew among the abandoned cars. Most encouraging of all, they could see smoke rising from cooking fires, proof that people were not merely surviving here but actually living. Their approach to the settlement required careful negotiation, as sentries challenged them from concealed positions long before the main gates came into view. The guards were professional but cautious, clearly experienced in dealing with both infected threats and human duplicity. After a tense exchange of questions and careful examination of their weapons and supplies, the group was escorted through a series of checkpoints designed to prevent any infected from infiltrating the community. Avalon District had indeed achieved something remarkable in this broken world. The shopping complex had been transformed into a multi-level community where families had carved out living spaces in former retail stores, where a school operated in what used to be a department store, and where workshops produced essential goods from salvaged materials. Children played in secured courtyards while adults tended rooftop gardens and maintained the complex systems that kept their society functioning. It was a glimpse of what humanity might become if it could learn to thrive rather than merely survive. The community's leaders, a council of 7 individuals elected from different districts within the complex, welcomed them with cautious hospitality. Resources were too precious to share freely with every refugee who arrived at their gates, but they had established a system where newcomers could earn their place through labor and demonstrated loyalty. Kalen and his companions were assigned temporary quarters in a former electronics store while they proved their worth and decided whether to make Avalon District their permanent home. As night fell over their first day in the settlement, the group gathered in their assigned space to discuss their future. Through the reinforced windows, they could see families sharing meals, couples walking hand in hand, and teenagers engaging in the awkward rituals of courtship that had persisted even through the apocalypse. It was almost possible to imagine that the world outside these walls was still whole, that morning would bring news reports and traffic jams rather than the endless struggle against extinction. Thorne was the first to voice what they were all thinking. This place offered something they had almost forgotten was possible. Safety. Community. Hope for a future that extended beyond the next supply run or the next shelter. Zephyr's eyes sparkled with excitement as she described the art supplies she had seen in the community workshop, while Solara seemed drawn to the agricultural projects that were turning concrete spaces into productive farmland. Even Kaelin, who had grown accustomed to the nomadic life, felt the powerful appeal of belonging somewhere again. Yet questions remained. Would they be accepted as full members of this community? Could they adapt to the rules and social structures that made such settlements possible? And perhaps most importantly, were they ready to stop running and start building something permanent in a world that seemed determined to tear down everything humanity tried to create? As they settled into sleep surrounded by the unfamiliar sounds of a living community, each of them grappled with the possibility that their long journey might finally be approaching its end. The integration process began the next morning with assignments to various work details throughout the settlement. Kaelin found himself assigned to the security patrol, where his experience navigating the infected-controlled territories made him immediately valuable. Solara joined the agricultural team, her knowledge of medicinal plants and food preservation proving essential to the community's long-term sustainability. Thorne was welcomed into the maintenance crew, where his mechanical aptitude helped keep the complex's power systems and water purification equipment functioning. Zephyr presented a unique case, as art was generally considered a luxury in survival situations. However, the settlement's leadership understood the importance of maintaining cultural and emotional connections to humanity's heritage. They assigned her to work with the children's education program, where she could teach art while also helping with more practical subjects. Her first project was creating a mural in the community center that would serve both as decoration and as a historical record of their collective journey through the apocalypse. Days blended into weeks as the group adapted to life within the settlement's protective walls. The work was hard but purposeful, each task contributing to the greater goal of building something lasting in a world that had forgotten how to build anything at all. Kaelin found satisfaction in training new security personnel, teaching them the hard-learned lessons of surviving in infected territory. His evening patrols along the settlement's perimeter became a form of meditation, a time to process the dramatic changes in their circumstances. The community operated on a complex system of mutual obligations and shared resources that required constant negotiation and compromise. Disputes arose regularly over everything from food distribution to living space allocation, but they were resolved through discussion and democratic process rather than violence. It was a remarkable achievement in a world where might typically made right, proof that human beings could still choose cooperation over competition even under the most desperate circumstances. Romance bloomed in unexpected places, as it always did when people found safety and stability. Kaelin noticed the growing connection between Solara and Marcus, a quiet engineer who had arrived at the settlement months earlier. Their relationship developed slowly, built on shared work in the gardens and long conversations about the world they remembered and the world they hoped to create. Even Zephyr attracted attention from several young men in the community, though she remained focused on her art and her role in educating the next generation. The settlement's greatest challenge came not from external threats but from internal growth. More survivors arrived regularly, each group requiring evaluation, integration, and accommodation within the existing social structure. Resources remained limited despite careful management, and every new mouth to feed strained the delicate balance that kept the community functioning. The council meetings grew longer and more contentious as difficult decisions about admission standards and resource allocation divided the leadership. Winter approached with particular significance for the Avalon District community. Previous settlements had often failed during the cold months, when heating fuel became scarce and fresh food disappeared entirely. The current residents had spent months preparing for this test, stockpiling supplies and improving insulation throughout the complex. Success would prove that their society could survive seasonal challenges, failure might scatter them back into the wasteland from which they had emerged. As the first snow began to fall, Kalen stood watch on the settlement's highest observation platform, gazing out over a landscape transformed by white silence. The infected moved differently in winter, their already sluggish responses slowed further by cold that their bodies could no longer regulate. This seasonal respite provided an opportunity for expansion and improvement, a chance to strengthen their defenses and explore the surrounding territory for additional resources. From his elevated position, he could see the entire community spread out below, workshops humming with activity, children playing in protected courtyards, adults moving purposefully between tasks that maintained their shared civilization. Smoke rose from numerous chimneys, creating a web of gray streams against the white sky. Gardens lay dormant under carefully constructed cold frames, waiting for spring's return. It was a scene of profound normalcy that would have gone unremarked before the outbreak but now seemed miraculous in its simple humanity. The journal Solara had given him had become a daily companion, its pages now filled with observations about their journey and their new life in Avalon District. Writing had become a way of processing the transition from constant survival mode to something approaching normal existence. The stories he recorded were not just personal history but community chronicle, documenting the birth of something new from the ashes of the old world. One evening, as winter deepened and the community gathered for their weekly social hour in the converted department store that served as their meeting hall, Kalen felt a profound shift in his understanding of their situation. This was no longer about surviving until some theoretical rescue or return to the old world. This was about creating something entirely new, something that incorporated the lessons learned during humanity's darkest hour while preserving the best aspects of what had been lost. The wind outside carried no whispers of the dead, only the natural sounds of weather moving through empty buildings that would soon house new dreams. Spring would bring new challenges and new opportunities, but for now, they had achieved something that had seemed impossible during those desperate early days. They had found home again, not in the place they had lost but in the community they had built together from hope and determination and the unshakable human refusal to surrender to despair. The years passed like seasons in Avalon District, each one bringing new challenges that strengthened the community's bonds rather than breaking them. The settlement expanded beyond the shopping complex, incorporating nearby buildings and eventually establishing satellite communities connected by secure transportation routes. Children who had never known the old world grew up thinking gardens in parking lots and rooftop classrooms were perfectly normal, their laughter echoing through spaces that had once known only commercial transactions. Kalen eventually became head of security, a role that evolved from simple protection against infected threats to complex coordination with other survivor settlements throughout the region. Trade routes developed between communities, carrying not just essential supplies but news, culture, and hope across the wasteland. He married Avalon, a doctor who had joined the community during its second year, and they raised 2 children who played games their parents had never imagined, creating new traditions from the fragments of the old world. Solara and Marcus established the settlement's first official school, where practical survival skills were taught alongside literature, mathematics, and history. Their curriculum emphasized both the technological knowledge needed to maintain their infrastructure and the cultural knowledge necessary to remember what humanity had been before the outbreak. Zephyr's art program became a cornerstone of community identity, with murals and sculptures transforming utilitarian spaces into expressions of collective memory and aspiration. Thorne discovered a calling in the ministry, providing spiritual guidance to a community that desperately needed to find meaning in survival. His services were non-denominational affairs that focused more on human connection and ethical behavior than specific religious doctrine. He officiated at weddings and funerals, blessed new construction projects, and counseled individuals struggling with the psychological challenges of building new lives from traumatic beginnings. The infected threat never completely disappeared, but it diminished significantly as the creatures succumbed to natural decay and the community's expanding safe zones reduced contact opportunities. Occasional outbreaks still occurred when scavenging parties encountered infected groups in outlying areas, but these incidents became increasingly rare and manageable. The real challenges shifted to distinctly human problems: resource management, interpersonal conflicts, and the philosophical questions of what kind of society they wanted to create. As the 5th anniversary of Avalon District's founding approached, the community organized its first formal celebration of survival and achievement. The festival stretched across 3 days, featuring art exhibitions, musical performances, storytelling sessions, and demonstrations of various crafts that had developed within the settlement. Most significantly, it included the dedication of a memorial wall where names of the lost were carved in stone, ensuring that those who had not survived the journey would be remembered by future generations. During the memorial ceremony, Kalen found himself reading from the journal Solara had given him years earlier, now supplemented by several additional volumes that chronicled the community's growth and development. His words carried across the assembled crowd, describing their desperate early days and celebrating their collective achievements. Children listened with wide eyes to stories of a world they had never known, while adults nodded with recognition at shared memories of struggle and triumph. The evening of the final celebration day brought unexpected visitors, a delegation from the New Pacific Federation, a coalition of survivor settlements that had formed along the western coast. They brought news of similar communities thriving throughout the region, connected by radio networks and trade agreements that were slowly rebuilding some semblance of large-scale civilization. They also brought an invitation for Avalon District to join their federation, offering resources and protection in exchange for participation in the broader project of human recovery. The community debate over federation membership stretched across several weeks, with passionate arguments on both sides. Some residents feared losing their hard-won independence and unique culture to a larger bureaucratic structure. Others saw the invitation as an opportunity to contribute to something greater than their individual settlement, a chance to help rebuild civilization on a continental scale. The discussion process itself demonstrated how far they had come from the desperate early days when survival required autocratic decision-making. Eventually, the community voted to join the Federation while maintaining significant local autonomy, a compromise that satisfied most residents while opening new possibilities for growth and cooperation. The agreement ceremony was held during the spring equinox, with representatives from 12 other settlements witnessing the signing of documents that established formal relationships between communities scattered across hundreds of miles of recovering territory. As spring brought new growth to the settlement's expanded gardens and workshops, Kalen often found himself walking the perimeter paths that had once been his patrol routes. The walls were higher now, and much stronger, but they enclosed a space that had become genuinely alive rather than merely secure. The sounds of construction mixed with children's laughter, the hum of workshops blended with evening conversations, and the smoke from cooking fires carried the sense of a dozen different cuisines as the community's population diversified with new arrivals. The journal entries from those early days seemed to chronicle a different world entirely, one where hope was a luxury they could rarely afford and tomorrow was never guaranteed. Reading his own words from that time, Kalen was struck by how much they had all changed, not just in their circumstances but in their fundamental understanding of what was possible. They had started as refugees fleeing from disaster, they had become founders of something unprecedented. The wind still whispered through the buildings beyond their walls, but it no longer carried only echoes of loss and abandonment. Now it brought news from other settlements, the songs of birds returning to reclaimed green spaces, and the promises of a future that extended far beyond mere survival. The empty civilization they had once navigated was gradually filling again with human dreams and determination, building something new from the lessons learned in darkness. On quiet evenings, when the settlement settled into peaceful routine and the infected threats seemed like memories from another lifetime, Kalen would sometimes stand on the observation platform and look out over the lights of their community. Each glowing window represented a family, a workshop, a classroom, or a gathering place where people were actively choosing hope over despair, cooperation over competition, and growth over mere endurance. It was a sight that would have seemed impossible during those desperate early days, yet here it stood as proof that human beings could adapt, survive, and ultimately thrive even in the face of complete civilizational collapse. The story chronicled in his journals had become the foundation myth of their new society, taught to children as both history lesson and inspiration. But more importantly, it was still being written every day by every person who chose to contribute to their collective experiment in rebuilding humanity. The wind whispered through empty buildings far beyond their walls, but within their growing community, it carried the sounds of life being lived with purpose and hope, one day at a time, one decision at a time, one relationship at a time. In the end, perhaps that was the most profound victory of all, not just surviving the apocalypse, but proving that the human spirit could create meaning and beauty and love even in the aftermath of everything they had once thought essential to civilization. The empty buildings would gradually fill again, but this time with something stronger because it was built by people who understood exactly how precious and fragile and worth protecting human community truly was.